Can you start recording now? Okay, so welcome back to the course. The lecture on the evaluation part. So on every Wednesday, I'll be teaching, and I'll be teaching how to evaluate your user interfaces. So I'll be teaching around user study methods and how to run them and what kind of things you have to consider and so forth. And last week we kind of briefly introduced you about the field of HCI research in general, and then talked about what the evaluation takes part in terms of the whole research process. And today I'm going to talk a little bit more detail about the main method in evaluation, which is user study. And so last week we talked about the HCI research, how the evaluation fits within the process of the HCI research, which is first identifying problems and needs, and then comparing with the state of the art, which was the assignment that I gave you. So hopefully you have had time to look into Google Scholar or other types of websites that you can find some academic papers around your topic of interest. And then once you know what's your problem and then the next step will be thinking of how to solve that problem, which is designing a solution. And then once you have that solution in your mind, and if you have some pictures of what you would like to try, then you start implementing it or prototyping it. And then once you have some sort of working prototype, then the next part is to evaluate it so that you can make sure your solution or your idea actually solves the problem that you wanted to solve. So that's testing your prototype or your idea. And then the last part will be, after you've done that, you reflect on the results and see if that could be generalized to solving other problems in other places. And of course, this is not a linear process that you go through once and finish everything, but it's a kind of a process that you repeat, and it's not necessarily that you do each step in a sequence, but sometimes you go back to the previous step or other steps depending on how you feel about your design. So for instance, once you identified your problems and requirements, you start designing something. But while you're designing, you might realize that the problem you actually thought of was actually not the problem, but there is another problem that you have to solve first, or which you might think of. And again, once you have the design, you start implementing something, but while you're implementing something, you might realize the design had some critical issues or critical faults. So you might need to go back to your design board and change some of your design and so forth. And same with the evaluation. And again, the final, so after you evaluate your prototype, it's not necessary that that's finished, but most of the time, the outcome of the evaluation is a feedback of how to improve your prototype or your design. So you might have to go back to your design or prototype or even your problem statement and see if everything worked out well, or if it didn't, then you should start thinking of how to improve it. So in an essence, the outcome of evaluation is basically a feedback that what worked or what didn't, so that you can know that if your idea or your solution or your prototype of your user interface was a good solution for the problem you've identified, or if it didn't, then the feedback you've collected through the evaluation will help you how to improve your idea or your design. So, and then we briefly talked about from whom we get the feedbacks, and at the early stage of your research, usually yourself will be assessing your own prototype or so forth. You can ask your colleagues or even experts, like you can ask Mark or some other professors to see if that's a good solution or not. So those could be done in the early stages, but as you move on with your research process, and as you have more tangible prototypes in your hand, then you should start looking into testing your idea with the end users, which are the people in the end who are going to use your solution. So it's critical to always test with the end users. So that was what we've talked about last week, and today we are going to, and we also talked about there are different ways to evaluate your prototype, and mainly there are two ways, which is one, testing it against user, and the other way was asking the experts and ask them to point out some problems based on the heuristic rules or based on their previous experience to find out some problems. But the main method we use in HCI for evaluating a certain type of interface is to do user study, because it's all about how the users use your interface and how effective or how efficient it is. So user studies are investigating how users easily or efficiently use the interface, the human-computer interface, and the methods you use or the steps you go through is observe how they use them and describe it in your own words. And once you have your observation, then you try to explain why that happened and what was the reason why the user was doing certain things with your user interface and so forth. And afterwards, once you explained how and why users were behaving that way, then you can generalize it and predict how this could be applied to other types of interface and so forth. And by doing this, so again, using testing or evaluating your user interface against user, which is called user study, is the main method used in the ACI field. And since it's about the user themselves, how they behave, it's very closely related to other field of study, such as behavior science in psychology, or in industrial engineering, they also look into ergonomics or human factors, which is how people easily get fatigued or tired when the button is too big or if the lever is too stiff and so forth. So, but still, and mostly they traditionally they focused on man-machine interface, which not necessarily have to be a computer, but again, a computer itself is a machine that you interact with. So those findings in industrial engineering could be also very related to ACI field. So keep in mind that the methods we use in ACI would have been originated from these other fields of study. So in ACI research, or in general in any kind of research or investigation, there could be mainly three types of research or investigation. The first one is descriptive investigation or research, which is focusing on describing what is happening. So for instance, when you're assessing a keyboard, descriptive investigation will tell you with this keyboard, people can type like 300 characters per second or so forth. So that's a description describing what's happening. And the relational investigation is looking into if there are some factors related with each other. So for instance, if you are testing this type of keyboard and you tested against like hundreds of users and collected their speed of typing, and then if you look into like if you want to see if there is a relationship between the age of the participant and the typing speed, or their experience with something, it's hard to make up an example with the typewriting, but or even if you want to compare between the gender and see if male is faster typers than females or so forth. So if you want to find some relationship between certain factors against how people use the interface, then that's the relational study.
Can you give another example for descriptive investigation?
Descriptive investigation. So it's basically Um, so, for instance, if you have a new type of mouse you invented,
Yeah.
and if you wanted to look if how, even if how that's comfortable to your hand,
Okay.
so and you collected a bunch of feedback, like users gave you um, feedback in saying this button is too big or blah blah blah, or if this is too stiff to, or if it's too heavy to move around. That's describing what's happening, right? That's describing what's how useful the mouse is, or how.
Or else is it instructing someone to accompany some task, like for example the mouse?
Hmm?
Is that person able to accompany certain tasks? Is that part of descriptive investigation, or or is it just a usability thing that is handling with
It
the
can be. It could be whatever. You could ask them to do certain tasks, or you can ask them to just freely use it. It doesn't necessarily. So it doesn't care what type of instruction you're giving. But the main thing is that descriptive investigation is about just plainly describing what's happening or what's.
So it's a generic task.
Yeah, it's generic task. So, and the relational investigation is it's not only talking about this is happening, but relational investigation is trying to see what relates to another factor, such as if there is a relationship between gender or age group or expertise level to what's happening. So for instance, if male is feeling that mouse more heavier than the females, or so forth. So that's relational investigation. And experimental investigation is kind of more formal investigation you do when you invent a new type of interface. And this is about the causal relationship. So this is about if something is causing to happen something. So for instance, if you invented a new mouse and you claim it that the new mouse is if the user uses your new mouse, it's faster and more accurate. And then what you have to prove or show is that the new mouse design itself is causing that improvement in the user performance, right? So in that case, what you usually do is you have a controlled settings, like you have another mouse which didn't have your new design on it, and you compare those two, which one has a new design that causes the effect, and one doesn't has the factor that causes the effect, and compare them to and see and to show that the new design causes to result in new better performance and so forth. So those are three types of user studies or investigation or research that we can do. And in most of the cases in the academic field, people are more into the latter two. So, yeah, relational investigation or experimental investigation. But in the industrial part, descriptive investigation itself could be also useful. Like if you are testing a new website and if you want to see how people are, how it is easy to navigate between the menu interfaces, then you don't necessarily have to look into how it is different from male and female or how it's related. So, but you might be purely interested in how much people click the wrong button or so which is a descriptive thing. Okay, so this table kind of summarizes the three. So descriptive research, in general, what it claims is something is happening. So people is clicking the wrong button like 10 times every out of 100 trials or so. So that's trying to come up with the conclusion of something is happening. Relational studies is trying to show that something is related to another thing. And the experimental study is trying to make conclusions. Something is responsible for something. So something is causing something. So the new design is making people work faster or more efficient and so forth. And usually for this type of studies, they use different types of methods which we will go through. And usually the first two type of research is also called exploratory, because compared to experimental, which is having a very clear purpose or goal that you want to prove something. But exploratory study usually the goal is very high level, and it's in general trying to understand more about what's happening and what's related to which. But experimental study is more goal oriented, trying to prove that something is happening because of something. So, and last time we talked about different types of research questions. So you can have different level of details in research questions. For like in general, if you are interested in is the new interaction technique any good? If this is your research question, then maybe descriptive study could be enough, because you can say these good things happened or these bad things happened when users were using. Another type of study, like if your interest or your research question, your main topic is about if you want to find some relationship between certain groups of users and their performance or their satisfaction of their user experience, then relational study is what you want to do. But if you want to claim that if your new interaction techniques or new interface is better than existing ones, then the experimental studies are what you have to do. So, but in general, so despite of these different level of or different types of research questions you have, in general, the user study flows in this process. So at the first stage, you set your goal or your research question, of course. And depending on your research question, you choose the method you want to use. And usually, despite of different methods, what you do next is let your users or subjects try your user interface. So you can either let them do specific tasks, or you can either let them just freely try it out without any specific instruction and so forth. But while they are trying your user interface, exploratory studies usually just ask them to try it out or do some sort of test. But experimental studies, you'll have to have different conditions. Like you'll have to have your new design, but you'll have to also have older design so that you can compare between the two to prove that the new design actually is causing better experience or so. So those are the two differences happening depending on your type of study. But anyway, basically it's about letting your user try certain type of interface. And then you collect feedback from them, either qualitative or quantitative, which is qualitative means descriptive form in sentences or words, and quantitative we mean described by numbers, such as how fast, like time they needed to complete certain tasks or so forth. And this collecting feedback could be either done while they're using your interface, or it could be done after they finished using your interface. So for instance, counting the number of times they click the wrong button could be done while they are using the interface. But like if you are going to ask them how easy it was to use, then that might be better to do it once they are done using it. And then once you collected those feedback, then you analyze them, and then try to see if the results answers the question that you initially had at the first stage of your user study. So that's a typical flow of a user study. And today we're going to talk about what kind of different methods you can use for this. So there are different approaches and methods that you can use for doing user study, and we'll be going into more details in the later lectures during this semester. But today I'll be just briefly going through different methods and briefly describing what they are. And again, this this top methods up here are mostly descriptive or in relational investigation method that doesn't necessarily prove something or show something that something causes some effect on the user experience. But the last one, the user experiment, is the only one that is an experimental investigation type of thing. And usually in academic papers or academic studies, this is the final goal, that you want to have something in your research so that you can show other people that your new idea is actually making any difference or making to the current field. So we'll briefly go through each of the methods and explain what everything is about. So the first one is observation, which is basically watching what people is doing. And there are different approaches or different types of observations depending on where you are doing it or how much you're controlling the user. So you can initially divide them into direct and indirect observations. So direct observation is actually the experimenter or the researcher yourselves are watching people directly and observing what's happening. And this could be done either in the field or in controlled environments. So in the field, which means the environment where the users are actually using their interface. For instance, could be their office, or could be their home, or if it's a mobile interface, then it could be outside walking in the streets or so forth. And when you're doing this, you can have different degree of participation. So for instance, you can just ask them to use it, and just yourself could be a pure observer, so you don't interfere with them or you don't interact with them so much, but you just be a third person who observes what's happening. Or you could be also participate in the process and interact with them more actively and help them out so that you can be part of the interaction itself. And this type of approach would happen more frequent in the early stage of your research. So you might want to go out, and so if you're designing a new type of keyboard, you might go out and watch people using their keyboard while they are typing in their offices, or see if they are having some troubles or so. So this could be done in the early stage of your research. On the other hand, you can also do observation in controlled environments. So usability testing, which we'll talk about it next week, is a typical example that you put, if you develop a new type of interface, you ask the users to come to your lab and you ask them to use the new product you have, and you watch them in a half-silver mirror, behind the half-silver mirror, and see if they have make any mistakes, or if they use the interface in a proper way and so forth. So that kind of usability testing is an example of doing observation in a controlled environment. And we'll talk about the think aloud method tomorrow, but it's basically asking them while they're using the interface to talk about what they are thinking and actively talk out what they are thinking in their minds. So those kind of things is direct observation, which is basically the researcher directly observing what people are doing. But there could be also indirect observation methods, which is not actually watching them, but using other tools to observe what's happening. So one of the typical examples is using logging data. So if you want to see how many times the user presses the wrong button, then it's not necessary that you have to watch them and count the number of pressing the wrong button, but you can actually make the system create a log file on the system and count the number of the buttons they pressed, and then based on that log data, you can basically observe what people are doing. Another more informal ways are diaries or culture probes, which is if you develop a new mobile device or a wearable device that you have to wear and try to see how they are using it in their everyday life, then it's not easy for you to always follow them and make an observation how they are using it. So what they do is let them keep some kind of diary every day, like give them a diary and then ask them to write how they use it during the daytime every day or so. Or the other concept or tool people use is called cultural probes, which is basically a small package that includes different types of tools, including cameras or diaries or some instructions how to do certain things and so forth, and asking them to leave some notes or some recordings of what happened. So one of the typical examples is giving them a camera and then asking them to take a picture of whenever you are using your interface or whenever you are facing a certain situation where you think the user thinks it's interesting for using a certain type of interface or so forth. So again, these are kind of indirect way to record something, what happened, and observe it later on. So, and another type of user study method is called interview or focus group. And compared to observation, which you are really observing what's happening, this is to ask the user directly about how good is your user interface and so forth. So it's basically asking the user's question and I'm trying to get verbal feedback from them. And it's basically using direct conversation. So you ask the question and then the participant answers your questions. And interviewing is when you do this one at a time. So if you are asking questions to one person, that's called interview. And if you have more than one person in a group, and if you're discussing about the usefulness of your interface, then that's called focus group. So, and not only you can ask them in a through verbal communication, but you can also do this in written way, right? So you can write up your question and give it to the user and then let them write up what they think or what's their answer about the questions. And this is using questionnaires and doing surveys. And survey is the method, the name of the method where you use a questionnaire. And the questionnaire is basically a document, either on a paper or on a website that has a list of questions that you ask the participants to answer. And the survey or using questionnaire, it should be typically self-administered, which means once you give the questionnaires out, it should be clear enough that they can read the questionnaires by themselves and answer the questionnaire by themselves without yourself needing to explaining it or helping out to how to answer them. So, and since they are typically self-administered, it's a good thing with surveys is that you can send out the surveys out to a large number of people and collect them easily. Like when you're doing census, they just send out the questionnaires and then collect them once they filled it out. So you can relatively do collect feedback from large number of participants, and that doesn't necessarily have to have your participants in your lab. And also, it's good for collecting sensitive and private information. So if some of the questions could be sensitive or for privacy, then when you're doing interviews, it might be making some barriers for the participants to answer in certain ways. But if you're doing a questionnaire, then it's much more easier to get sensitive feedback from the users. And in summary, it can capture the big picture with relatively quick way. And then, so that's survey and questionnaire. And then the last type is experimental studies, which is trying to discover or verify new knowledge, which means new interface you developed by investigating the causal effect between the two or more things, which means if your new design is actually causing improvement of user performance or experience. And in experimental study, we normally have the concept of variables, and the term we use is independent variable and dependent variable. And by independent variable, we mean the type of interface you are trying to compare. So it's sometimes independent variable is also called controlled variable as well, which you control. So type of interface you can control to have interface type A, B, or C, and so forth. So you can control them or design them. And by dependent variable, it means the measure you collect after the user is using your interface. So it's if you think of the causal effect, what you're going to try to prove. So independent variable is the cause of the thing, and the dependent variable is the outcome of that causing factors. And this could be user performance, such as time they needed to complete certain tasks, or the level of satisfaction after using those interface, or usability, and so forth. We'll go through this in detail later on. And when you're doing a user experiment or experimental study, the very first step you'll have to do is establish a research question, and a special type of research question in experimental studies called hypothesis, which is a prediction of the outcome. So hypothesis is a sentence that describes if you do this, then this could happen, and you're trying to prove that hypothesis if it is true or false. And you go through the experimental studies and defining your independent and dependent variables, and let them do certain type of test, and then measure the results, which is the dependent variable, and try to answer the research question, which is basically trying to reject or retain the hypothesis and make conclusion out of it, and by using statistical analysis. So these are the again, this is the summary of the user study methods we will be talking about throughout the rest of the lectures this semester. And as you can see here, again, the methods above are the descriptive or relational investigation type of research methods. And the last one, which is the user experiment, is the experimental investigation. And at the early stage, you usually end up using the methods above, but as you move on to the later stage of your research and you have more solid implementation of your idea, then you start looking into more formal investigation, which is usability testing or user experiment. But one thing I would like to remind you from my previous lecture is that there is nothing wrong or correct method that you can choose from, and it all depends on which stage of your research is at, or what kind of research question you're trying to answer. And always, it's not necessary that you have to choose only one method from here, but you always would need to mix and match some of the different methods so that you can make sure that one finding from one type of study is in lining with another finding from another type of study, and we call it triangulation, mix and matching different studies, and then making sure they are making consensus out of the different methods. So those are different methods. We'll be learning more details in the later lectures. But today I would like to talk a little bit more about the type of feedback we gather after doing this research study. And there are different ways to categorize the feedbacks, and the one typical way is to categorize them into qualitative and quantitative feedback. And qualitative feedback means it's describable in words or sentences. So it's appearance, like does it look big, small, or medium-sized, or so it's describing in words. How beautiful it is, then you have to describe it in your words, and so forth. But the downside is it's hard to analyze them, because it's a described sentence. Then you have to read them and comprehend them, and then you have to analyze them in a more complicated way. On the other side, we can have quantitative feedback, which is basically feedback given in numbers, such as like if we go back to the size, then we can have the diameter of certain things, or the length or height, or like time, how long the people took to do certain tests. Those are represented in numbers. And these are easier to analyze because we have mathematical tools, which is basically statistics that we can analyze them and draw in graphs or tables. Doesn't necessarily mean that the qualitative feedback will be summarized always in a qualitative form. You could have collected qualitative feedback from the users in written or through interviews, but you can also quantify them by categorizing certain types of feedback. For instance, if you ask them what's well, the only example I'm currently thinking of is the color. So if you ask them what's the tone of the color, this is not good for HCI, isn't it? I should think of a better example. But anyway, if you have collected described people gave you a descriptive feedback, then you can group them into certain types of feedbacks, and then you can count the number of how many people give certain types of feedback, so that you are actually quantifying them, quantifying the qualitative feedback, and you can report it in a quantitative form. So anyway, so there are basically two types of feedback: qualitative, which is in descriptive form, in words, and quantitative feedback that could be numbers. And sometimes we also talk or categorize the studies in terms of what kind of feedback you are mainly gathering. And sometimes we say this study is a qualitative study when you are gathering more qualitative feedback rather than quantitative feedback. And we call a certain type of study method quantitative study when you are collecting or focusing more on the quantitative feedback, like time or so forth. And again, if we go back to the study methods, you can easily see that the methods above are more qualitative, and the methods below are more focusing on quantitative studies, quantitative feedback. So again, qualitative studies are usually trying to answer more broader or high-level research questions, while quantitative studies are trying to answer more narrow or specific questions. And usually they are using exploratory study, and quantitative studies usually you have conclusive or experimental study. And of course you use them at the early stage of your research and later stage of research. Although we have qualitative and quantitative type of feedbacks, there is also another way to categorize the feedbacks, which is objective and subjective feedbacks. And by objective, we mean it's not influenced by personal feeling or opinion. On the other hand, subjective measures or feedback means it's based on users' opinions or interpretations or points of view. And for instance, objective measures could be like time to complete the task. That's objective measure. It's not affected by personal feelings or opinion. For subjective measure, could be how easy it was the user to use that interface. That's based on how user feels. If it's easy or not, that's subjective measure. And by its nature, objective measures are more consistent. So, but on the other hand, subjective measures, since it's depending on users, should be more vulnerable to the context or the user status, and could be different between the users as well. So some people might think it's easy, some people might think it's hard to use, depending on their level of expertise or their cultural background or so forth. So to add a little bit more activity to, more activity to this lecture, can we think of any examples of some different types of feedbacks or measures that you can measure in a user study? Like maybe Melody? Can you think of something you can measure during the user study? Any type.
How long between you click your mouse and feedback from screen?
So you use your mouse and what do you mean by feedback? Do you mean asking them something or?
Like you click the button on the screen,
Huh?
and how long it will take from you clicked and feedback from.
So you mean time to click certain things on the screen? Yeah. So do you think that's objective or subjective? Like if you measure the time, obviously it's objective. And is it quantitative or qualitative? It's time. So time is measured by numbers, right? So it's quantitative measure that you measured. Any other examples you can think of? Like, yep, Shen.
I usually give them to some tech users, such as who is very long a project and maybe not have experience with product for a long time. And then give them and get some feedback. Such as I put this button here. If I change the button's place, I will get their feedback.
And how do you get their feedback? Like, do you ask them? So yeah.
Do you answer my question?
Okay, so you're collecting feedback by asking the user, and would that be subjective? Yeah, subjective, since it's their opinion.
Yeah.
And should be, it's.
I think that should be positive. If positive. Because it's give them the direction, such as the place they give. If I put it on the red top and have you object or feel green, it's the.
But it's not describing numbers, but it's more like describing words, right? So the way we discriminate between quantitative and qualitative is quantitative. You always have to have kind of numbers to describe it, but qualitative is more like a descriptive form. So if you're gathering the feedback that the user asked that you to move this button to this side, then that's a descriptive feedback you got, which is a qualitative feedback. Okay. So.
But if I have two types of design, one is in this place and the other is in the other place. And if you choose one, I think it's the exact place. Because in iPhone screen and it's just this point. I think it's the quantity.
Well, it's still like if it's better, the button is placed here or there. It's not about it has to be at pixel 321 or so. Yeah. So if your study was trying to measure the exact place of the button in pixels, like trying to find out if, like for instance, if you have two buttons next to each other and you are trying to find out how much gap you have to put between the buttons to make sure the people doesn't make mistakes, then you can have the measure do an experiment having different number of pixels apart between the button, and then do an experiment and count the number of people pressing the wrong button, and then that could be like it's quantified by numbers. So in that case, it could be thought as quantitative feedback. But if it were just having buttons in two different places and asking them to describe which one is easier or so forth, then it's more like focusing on having a quantitative, qualitative feedback, even though it's could be an experimental study. Any other examples? Yeah.
Can you give me some example about in the real project and you use the
Quantitative.
Yeah,
Quantitative. So I'll actually go through typical objective measures, and so maybe I'll just go through the list I've have as an example. So for typically objective measures, so time is one of the very typical objective measure. You can measure them, time, and it's also quantitative, right? So it's in numbers. Errors such as number of times people press the wrong button or percentage could be measured in number, and it's objective. It's not based on user's feeling. Accuracy, like if you are trying to assess a pointing device such as a mouse, then you can measure how much error they made when they had to point accurately. Then that's all, again, you can describe them in numbers, like how many pixels the error was, and so forth. So that could be, again, quantitative and objective. Percentage of tasks completed, you give them like 10 tasks and ask them, do them using your interface and count the number of tasks they completed with a certain amount of time. Then that's, again, it's a number, it's quantitative, and it's still objective. So physiological data such as heart rate, again, it's again feedback that you get through numbers, since it's quantitative, and again, it's objective because you can measure them without. And others like orientation, position, movements for if you're assessing a 3D pointing device. Scores, such as test scores, could be objective measures, number of actions, words or gestures, so how many actions that you have to do to certain tasks, or the time that took for people learning something, or how many things they remembered after using the certain interface or so. So those are kind of objective measures, and most of them are actually quantitative, so that they are in numbers, right? The other hand, subjective measures could be like ratings, like if you ask people, use your new interface and ask them how easy it was from 0 being very hard to 10 being very easy, then people can answer you different ways. So the ratings could be one of the subjective measure because that's based on what user feels, if it's easy or not. But doesn't necessarily mean that subjective measures are qualitative or quantitative, because if you ask them how easy it was, then if the people gave you feedback like talking, like it was very easy, or it was very hard, or it was kind of not too easy, but something, if they give feedback through verbal communication, then that's qualitative, right? But it's still subjective. But if you ask them to rate the easiness from 0 to 10, 0 being very hard and 10 being very easy, and if the participant answered back in like it's kind of 7 out of 10, then that's a number that you got back. So that's subjective, but it's quantitative. Okay, and ranking is another thing that if you had like 3 different interfaces, then ask them to which one they most preferred and let them rank them based on their preference. Then that's a subjective measure because that's asking them which one do you prefer. But if you can quantize it by asking them to rank them, like giving first rank for interface A, the B was the second one, and the third one is C, and so forth. So that's again a subjective measure that you can use quantitative or quantifiable feedback. User satisfaction is subjective. Again, you can measure it in qualitative way or quantitative way. So there are some quantitative measures such as system usability scale, which is a bunch of questionnaire with a rating, and then it gives you out a certain number from 0 to 100, showing how much level of usability or how much a level of user satisfaction it has. So again, subjective measure could be either qualitative or quantitative. And usefulness, how easy it was to use, how easy it was to learn, how intuitive it was, how natural they felt when they're using it, how stressful it was. Again, stress could be measured either through qualitative way, asking them to describe how stressful it was, but you can also measure other type of questionnaires, such as asking them rating how stressful it was from 0 to 100 or 0 to 10, so forth. But again, how stressful it was could be also sometimes measured in objective way. Can you think of an objective way to measure how stressful it was? So,
Heart rate or
yeah, heart rate could be one measure, objective measure of the stressfulness, or you can measure kind of
blood pressure.
yeah, blood pressure or your tension on your muscle, or so again, you can measure the same thing in different perspectives. So you can measure it from objective, in an objective way or subjective way.
How do you better describe eye tracking or heat map sensing?
Heat map sensing
Yeah.
or eye tracking.
Yeah.
So
is it an objective or is it a subjective? It's both subjective as well as subjective.
yeah, so it's so heat map sensing or eye tracking itself could be the measure itself is objective because, but the purpose of measuring that is trying to find out subjective feelings out of that measure. But the measure itself is objective.
So it's both.
Yeah. That's and yeah, judgment and presences maybe I'll skip that. So as you can see here, there are different types of feedbacks. Sometimes it could be qualitative or quantitative, subjective or objective. And there are different methods that we use for collecting different types of feedback. And if you're trying to collect qualitative feedback, observation, interviews or survey would be more relevant methods that you can use. You're trying to collect qualitative feedbacks. And when you're observing something, you can make a note or record them in audio or video. So same wise in interviews or in a survey, then you can have questions such as open questions, which is not asking them to rate in numbers, but you can ask them to describe something. What kind of problem did you have while you were using this interface? Then they describe what kind of problem they had, and that could be qualitative feedback. In collecting quantitative feedback, we can think of, when you're collecting quantitative feedback, you can think of objective measures, which for the quantitative feedback, you can manually observe using, well, let's say, for example, if you're counting the number of times people pressing the wrong button, again, keep saying with this example, then it could be, it's an objective measure, right? Number of times they press the wrong button, and it's quantitative since it's number. And you can either do manually observing it, so as an experimenter, you can watch what they're doing and then counting how many times they pressed the wrong button. But you can also introduce an automatical process, which is if you log the interaction in a log file, then you can do that. Or in the other way, you can also use a camera or a sensor to detect some of the events and collect them. For subjective measures, and we are talking about quantitative feedback here, so we are talking about ratings, like how easy it was, rate from 0 to 10 or so. So those kind of feedback, you can either ask them to manually record, so questionnaire having those rating questions could be a typical example, or another way, or making it automatically recorded, could be also done for collecting subjective quantitative feedbacks by using some props. So one of the examples is there are some studies in virtual reality where where people ask people how much it is likely that you are in that environment, which is called presence. But anyway, or within a game, asking them to rate how much they were immersed in the game or into was focused in the gaming environment. And sometimes you can ask them later on to rate them in a questionnaire, but sometimes you also have a kind of a mechanical lever that asking them people to push it up when you are getting bored, or push it down when you're very excited, and so forth. So it's kind of a semi-automatic way to record the user's subjective yet quantitative, depending on the where your lever was placed. So forth. So there are different ways to measure this kind of feedback. Couple of things that you might have to think of or keep in mind while you are doing measuring. When you choose a certain type of measurement, try to use the method that's least intrusive. So for example, the example just I gave with pushing the levers, it could be kind of good for finding the trend of people feeling different over their use of certain games, or watching a movie or so. But it could be also intrusive, because since they have to also do this task while they're experiencing the game or the virtual environment, that could be bothering them to not, bothering them to focus on the game or focus on the task they were given. So it could be quite intrusive or affecting the user's feeling. So might not be good from that perspective. And also try to reduce human error. So it's always more desirable to automate the measurements. So if you're counting the number of times people pressing the wrong button, it's better to create a log file instead of yourself counting the numbers. So it's always better to reduce human error. But it doesn't necessarily mean that automated method doesn't have an error. So sometimes the logging file could be corrupted, or logging file could have some troubles and run out of space on your hard disk, so it didn't create a log file or so. So it's always important that you check your metric or instrument that you are collecting your measurements. And for that, it's in HCI we use the term pilot testing. So before you actually run your study with your participants, you actually run it by yourself or with your colleague, so that making sure everything is working, the logging file, creating logging file, and those things are all working. So it's quite important to do the pilot test. And another thing you might have to keep in mind is to label the logs or your measurements properly. So especially when you're doing an experimental study, and if you are comparing like two numbers, say you are trying to compare between two different types of keyboard layouts, and if you are collecting the number of characters they typed in minutes, and you created a log file, it's important that you label them properly. Otherwise, you might end up like you created two log files, but you might mix up that, thinking this log file was from the other setup. So it's important to make sure you label them, the condition and date and time you collected, which might help later on to identify which condition it was actually, and the subject ID as well. And it's always better to summarize them or check them or have a look at the created log file or the measurement as soon as possible, because it helps you identify certain problems at the early stage. Like if you looked at the log files, check the log files right after the study, then it's and let's say if there was some problem with the log file, then if you check them later on, once you've done like 10 or 20 participants and you find out the log file has certain problem, then it's not good. But if you check them earlier, like after you did one participant, and if you look through the log file and you found some problem, then it's better because you can fix them and then do the rest of the study with the fixed setup. So I think we've already talked about this in the study. Let's see, what time is it? Oh, so I think we talked a lot about this, so maybe we'll just skip this. I think it's about halfway through my slides. Do you want to take a break, or anyone need a bathroom break, or you're fine? Oh, so I'll just keep on going then. So the rest of the slides is talking about things that you have to keep in mind when you're working with participants or the users. And this is more about the human ethics side of the study. So we typically use the term participants in the study. So in other study fields, like another term that we can use is subject, human subjects. But sometimes it makes people feel like a rat in a lab. So we usually use the word participants rather than using subjects because it makes, well, it feels more polite. So users participating in the evaluation or of your prototype is participants. So those come to evaluate your study is called participant in your user study. And participants are representing the larger population of all the end users. So ideally, the best case is if you created something or a new interface and you want to test it, ideally you'll have to try to test it with all of the end users. And if you collect feedback from everyone, that will be the ideal case. But of course, it's not feasible in the real world. So what you do is you ask certain voluntary participant to come and evaluate it. And it's a kind of a subset of your target end user. So it's we call them samples of your end users. And since it's sampling from your whole population of your end user, the generalizability of your result could depend on how you sample them. So if you and also not how you sample them, but also the number of participants you had in your study. So if you had like 100 people in your study, then it has a more chance that your findings from your study could be generalizable. But on the other hand, if you had only 5 or so people in your study, participants in your study, then there's a higher chance that what you find in your study might not be true in general with the whole users out in the world. So in that sense, you always have to report how many people you had in your study and what kind of background they had and what are the age groups and so forth, which are called demographic information. So you'll have to always report that in your study results. And so thinking of how to recruit and how to have the participant in your study, the first question would be, how many participants do we need to have in your study? So always, the first question I always encounter when the master's or PhD students come to me asking about the user study design, they ask, when they have to run it, they ask me, how many participants do we have to run? Because that's one of the critical things that decides how many work that you have to do running the user study. So general answer is the more the better. The more the better, because as I've mentioned before, it's sampling out of your end user, which is the whole user out there in the field. So it's, if you have more participants, then it makes your study more generalizable. But if you think of your research from, the reason why people are asking how many participants is because of you don't want to do that many participants and you don't want to do like hundreds or so. So it's also restricted with your resources, with your time, with your amount of funding or your availability of your equipment or your environment that you can use for the study. So it's the general answer is the more the better, but we should come up with certain numbers we can think of. So the answer to how many participants depends on the purpose of the testing or the stage of your project, target user group, or time constraint and so forth. And usually when you're doing qualitative study or explorative study, it's more acceptable to have lesser number of people because usually this type of study takes more time than experimental study. So in rule of thumb, and here disclaimer is I'm not saying that these numbers are the fixed rule or so. It's just a rule of thumb, so it depends on your situation. It could be more or less. But in rule of thumb, if it's a qualitative study, then maybe less than 5 could be acceptable in your study. And if it's a really focused study, so for example, if you were testing a new interface for a disabled person, like if you're created a new interface for a blind person, then it might be quite hard to find many people for your study. So in that case, it might be good to do a qualitative study to get as much as qualitative feedback from the user, but you might end up like having 1 or 2 subject or participant. So that's kind of thing you can think of. For usability study, there is a research by Nielsen where he found that around 5 people could uncover 80% of problems. So usability study, we'll talk about this next week, but the main focus of usability study is to identifying the problems of your product so that you can fix them. So in that case, if you, the number of problems you identify as you have more people, of course you will find more problem, you will discover more problem of your design when you have more people, but it will saturate as you have more people, right? So if you have, initially if you have one person trying your interface, you will find like 10 problems of your interface, but as you have more, they might find more problems, but most of the problems will be the same what you already identified with the first couple of people. So what Nielsen studied was that 80% of the problems are already identified when you have like 5 people. They mostly identified 80% of the problems. So in usability study case, usually 5 or so people is enough for identifying most of the problem. In experimental study, which is comparing different conditions, and this is a typical study that when you are trying to have an academic output, say like a thesis or a paper at a conference or a journal. So in an experimental study, the rule of thumb is having 15 to 20 people per condition. So if you had like 2 interfaces that you are trying to study, then you can have like 15 people using condition A, another 15 people using condition B, and so forth. So again, this is rule of thumb, and it doesn't necessarily mean that once you have 20 people, you will have meaningful result. That doesn't mean that, but it's just a rule of thumb that it's socially acceptable in the field of HCI, and which means if you have less than 15, if you had like 10 or so, then most of the case when you submit your paper, then the feedback from the examiners will be you have too little number, your participant is too small, so they might ask you to do more. But if it's kind of more than 15, around 20, then most of the reviewers there's a high chance that most of the reviewers will not complain about the number of participants you have. So that's, again, rule of thumb, and it will depend on what's your situation in your study. And especially when you are doing quantitative analysis, especially when you're using statistical tool, there is also a tool that you can use to decide how many participants you will have to have, and it's called power analysis. We'll come back to this later on when we talk about statistical methods later on. But anyway, there is a method that you can use in statistics that you can decide how many participants you might have to expect to run. But usually the number it prints out is higher than what you expect. So, so anyway, that's one thing you can keep in mind. Another thing that affects how many participants you can have is the background or expertise of your participants. So if you are trying to create for example, one of our master's student who is now writing up his thesis created studied on wearable interface for doctors, medical doctors. So in that case, since the participants that he had to have in his study required an expertise, which is having a medical doctor, being a medical doctor, so he ended up not being able to recruit more than 10 participants. So depending on what kind of expertise you expect from your participant, it might affect how many participants you might end up as well. And also, obviously, time constraints is also what really affects your number of participants as well. Hopefully, and not only the number of participants, but you'll have to also find the right type of participants as well. If you are, again, if you come back to the example of that medical interface, then if you are trying to evaluate new interface for the doctors, then you might better have the participant from medical background rather than just having random people using your interface, right? And same-wise, if you design some new interface for children, then it's better to test your user interface with children as a subject rather than testing it with grown-ups. So you'll have to recruit the right type of participants for your study as well. And in many cases, this is also a trouble when you are running studies with graduate students. You usually have troubles with this. So most of the cases you run your study with your friends at the lab or people who know by yourself personally, which kind of restricts the group or expertise or type of person that you can have in your participants. So it's better to try to recruit people out of your social relationship so that you can randomly recruit from. You can either do recruitment through putting up posters or posting messages on the Facebook or so that you can have random people participating in your study. It's better to do that. So these are some of the examples of the factors that could be considered when you are trying to identify the type of participants you want in your study. So sometimes your study would like to look into different cultural backgrounds and cultural effects of your study results. So you can also think of that, or level of education could be also one thing you might have to think of. And of course, the expertise or gender and age. And gender and age is one of the typical categories that you sometimes look into. And how you recruit the participants. The most ideal case is random sampling, that which means you're giving an equal chance to everyone in the population to participate in your study. So that's an ideal way to do that. But in many cases, it's very hard to do that. So because since your end user is out there in all over the world, and you cannot really give them equal number of chances to participate in your study, you might end up mostly recruiting your participants around your social or geographical location. So another way people try to do is called stratified sampling. And example is if your target users have like, if you're 30%, let me just read it. If 30%, 38% of your population is college educated, then maybe your samples could also have 38% of college educated participants. So when you recruit them, maybe you can restrict the number of college educated people to be 38% and fill up the rest of the participants with different level of education and so forth. So that's called stratified sampling. And most of the cases we have, and which is thing that we need to avoid, is convenience or accidental sampling, which means just recruiting or asking people around you to participate in your study. And always you'll have to think of, when you're deciding the way you recruit them or how to sample them, you'll have to think of if this will affect your study results or so. So you should think of either you'll need to stratify your samples or just do the random sampling or so. So how to recruit the participants? You can do either advertise about your study and try to recruit, or you can also go through certain community groups. For instance, if there is a group of people interested in wearable computers, then maybe that group could be one of the venues that you try to recruit your participants. You can use email list, online groups like on Facebook or social networks, or participant pools that you can recruit your participants from. When you are doing more focused studies, such as ethnography, or like the example of when you're trying to assess your interface for disabled people, then it might be better to, rather than doing advertisements in general, it might be good to contact certain community groups of them or try to build relationship with them before you actually ask them to participate in your study and so forth. And always a good tool that you can use to lure people to participate in your study is to give incentives such as cash or vouchers. Or if your budget is limited, then rather than giving out every participant a cash or a voucher, then you can tell them you will do a raffle to give out a prize or something. So that could be also one tool that you can use. But on the other hand, the question you have to think of is that, will the incentive influence the result as well? So if you are giving out incentives depending on how they perform, then it could influence the study. Like say, if you're giving out the same amount of money, that could, regardless of your performance, then that might make some people do not being what's the word? Not being earnest or of doing certain tests you asked. But on the other hand, if you are saying that you'll give more incentive if you perform better, then that also might have a problem of people trying to do excessively better than what they actually normally do, which will bias the study. So you have to be careful of when you're going to give some incentive, then you'll have to decide how you're going to give the incentive either at the beginning of the study or either at the end of the study, or are you going to tell it at the beginning, or are you going to keep it until once the experiment is done and just give them afterwards or so. And for future consideration, you can build a database or a list of contacts that you can ask them later on when you have another study. I think the lab, some of the students might have some mailing list that they usually mail out to ask for participants and so forth. So that could be also useful. And the other aspect of recruiting participants is about participants' rights and human ethics. The things that you have to make sure the participants is aware of are, there are certain things that you have to make sure that the participants are aware of, and the main thing is what are the rights of their participant while they are participating in the study. So they include, they have the rights of knowing what is the goal of the study. So you should briefly introduce what this study is going to investigate. And another thing you have to let the participant know is that what will happen to the findings. So you have to let them know if this is for your thesis, so that it will be published in the thesis, or if this is if this is going to related to the commercialization of your product or something. So the participants should have the right to know about it. And of course, they should be able to know about how their personal information will be treated in terms of privacy and so forth. And also they have the right to leave when they wish without penalty, which means, especially when your study has some, if there is a chance that people might feel stressful when they're participating in your study, you should let participants know that if they think they cannot handle it, they should be able to quit, even if they cannot complete everything. And obviously, they should be treated politely, of course. And when you're treating with the participant, you should be always remind yourself that you are testing your prototype, not the participants themselves, so that you make sure they don't feel as if they are feeling as if they are a rat in a lab or so. So it's always good to emphasize that you are testing the solutions or your prototype or your interface rather than how users perform. So because sometimes participants might feel a little bit embarrassed when they are not being able to finish certain tests that you asked to. So it's always good to let them know that their poor performance doesn't necessarily mean that because of they are bad or they are not competent, but it's more about there is something problem about the user interface. And to make sure these are in place, we always have to do we always have to get an informed consent from the participants, which is basically informing that what they have to know, and then receiving a consent from the users by signing a certain form that they are aware of certain problems or certain things, how the user study will have. So informed consent is basically two pieces, which is first informing the participants about what will happen during the user study, and consent is receiving a consent agreement from the participants that they are voluntarily participating in the study. And it's basically a document, and these are the things that you might have to make sure is included in the document. So from the informed side, you'll have to make sure participants are understanding the reason or the purpose of the study, and the procedures, what kind of procedures you will be going through the study, and potential risk if there is something. So, if, for example, if they're wearing an HMD and head-mounted display and you ask them to walk around, then you have to make sure that you tell them there is a certain risk, like you might bump to certain things, so you might have to remind of a wall or something that, that might be a potential risk. And afterwards, how to get more information about the study, or if they, or contact point where if they have some questions about the study later on and so forth. And the consent part, you should make sure the participants should be voluntarily participating in the study and free from any implied or implicit coercion or troubles later on because of participating in the study. And of course, when you're writing up this informed consent form, you should present this information clearly and accessibly. Make sure your font is readable and without any jargon. So make sure people can easily understand them. And this is a typical content inside the informed consent. But so title, purpose, and contact information, and so forth. One of the things that you have to make sure you include in your consent form is the risk again. So you can think of physical safety, such as obstacles around the environment, or if it's a task that could introduce some stress, physical or mental stress, then you have to make sure they are aware of it, so that if someone is has some mental or medical condition that they have to avoid certain stresses, then they should be aware of it. And of course, environmental hazards, when, if, for instance, if you are conducting your study outside, in the outdoor environments, then you have to make sure people are aware of environmental hazards, such as if there is a road then nearby, then you have to make sure people are told that they have to be avoiding crossing the road or something like that. It's also another part that you have to make sure is included in your informed consent form is that how you are going to protect the privacy. So some details could be how you are going to store your collected data, how you are, who are going to be able to access those collected information, and also how this could be, how long it will be kept, and how it will be disposed after your study, and so forth. But basically, you have to think of those type of questions and make sure you tell the participant how you will treat the recordings and so forth. And especially when you have some photographs or audio or video recording from your study, then you have to make sure the participant is aware of that you are taking those and how you are going to treat it. And once they are given those information, then they have to sign a certain form where they state that they are participating in the study voluntarily, so they are not forced to participate in the study. And they have to be informed about the task and procedure, and they state that they were informed about the task and procedures, and they had a chance to ask if they had any questions or so forth, and aware of that they can withdraw anytime, and so forth. And of course, this consent has to be done before they participate in the study. There are some cases that you might want to receive a consent at the end of your study. So for example, if you have recorded the study, and if there is a chance that that recording could affect the user. So for example, if your study was around how you interact with the robot, and if you were recording how people interact with the robot, and in that case, the study might be affected by either you tell the people you are recording how you interface, how you interact with the robot, they might behave differently. So in that case, it might be more relevant to not let them know that you're recording with a video. So, but you still have to tell them and get a consent from them when you're recording. So many cases, when they're doing this type of study, they initially get a consent about participating in the study. And then at the end of their study, once they've finished everything, they tell them, we actually recorded you, but if you don't want to want your recording to be used in your study, then they could bail out afterwards. So that's one way that you can do the consent at the end so that it doesn't affect the study itself. So I've talked through quite a lot of details of things that sometimes you could think it's an obvious thing that you have to do, but the problem is most of the cases you end up with thinking it as a hassle, and you might end up not doing it. So certain organizations have their own regulations or laws set up so that local organizations such as the university has its own regulations when you run a user study. And at the University of Canterbury, they have a committee named Human Ethics Committee who review the user studies so that they can make sure your study design doesn't have any problems or so. This is not only for keeping the rights of the participants and making sure they are protected, but it's also about protecting yourselves as well. Because if you haven't got your study reviewed by the Human Ethics Committee, then later on the participant can either sue you when they felt they were objected during the study. But if your study was reviewed by the committee, then the university can actually back up your study and say this was reviewed by this procedure, so those problems might not be relevant for asking for your responsibility. So it's always important that you are aware of this procedure, and this is the website that you can apply for this procedure. It's basically a form that you have to fill out about your study design and the informed consent form you prepared, and they go through a review process saying if there is something has to be changed in your study design and so forth. So that's pretty much all I have to talk today. If you want to learn more details, then there is a chapter in the book called Research Method in HCI, which I shown you at the first lecture. And chapter 2 and 14 are the relevant chapters that you can have a read. Or otherwise, the other chapters like 12, 13, and 15 could be relevant to your study depending on what kind of topic you are going to explore. But anyway, those are the chapters. For next week, we'll be talking more about usability testing. So you can have a read of that chapter if you are interested. So those are the chapters. And I have another assignment for this lecture. And again, this will be for 2 weeks. And it's just a 1 or 2 page report that you write up so first, I would like to ask you to write up your research question. I think this kind of overlaps with your first assignment. So you can pick some of the research questions from your first assignment, or you can come up with new research question if you feel it's more easier to do assignment, the second one. So first, try to state a couple of research questions, and then think of what kind of method. We learned about a lot of methods like observation, interview, survey, experimental methods, and so forth, and try to think of what kind of method will be most relevant to answer your research question. And then think of what kind of user feedback or measurements you will have to measure through the user study. Give examples of at least 3 or more, and then describe what kind of measure you are measuring. For example, say you are going to measure how much time people took to click something or something like that, and then describe if it's either qualitative or quantitative, or if it's objective or subjective. Then describe a little bit more about how you will collect them. For instance, if you are going to measure the time, are you going to measure the time with a stopwatch, or are you going to measure it with the logging data, or so? So it's just asking you to practice thinking of what kind of measurements you can have in your studies and how can you measure them. And again, the assignments you'll have to the same. So today's lecture material. Switch to the students. So the lecture slides are up in the Learn, so you can grab them from there. And also the assignment itself is also there, so you can read and also submit your own assignment as well. And the due date is 2 weeks from now. Any questions about today's lecture or assignment? Yep. Yeah, sometimes we talk about, sometimes you might feel that we are talking about very obvious things, but those are the things that we usually ignore in time. Yep, all good. So, thank you.